He was a ruthless millionaire CEO, until a 7-year-old girl saved his life and changed it forever. The lobby of the Grand Aurelia Hotel shimmered with wealth, a palace of polished marble floors, golden chandeliers, and uniformed attendants who moved with rehearsed precision. Guests whispered in several languages, their jewelry flashing under the lights as if to remind the world of their status. In the center of all this opulence, a man stood who was as much a symbol of power as the building itself. Michael Carter had walked into countless such halls in his life, and each time people turned their heads, sensing his presence before even recognizing his face. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the composure of someone who never allowed uncertainty to stain his demeanor. His dark hair, immaculately styled, only emphasized the piercing blue of his eyes that had stared down rivals in boardrooms and silenced entire negotiating teams. That morning he was dressed in a light blue suit tailored to perfection, a man who looked not only untouchable but indestructible, a figure as carefully constructed as the glass towers his company raised in every major city. Michael was at the hotel for a reason. In just a few minutes, he was to meet with European investors whose money would determine the next decade of expansion for his empire. The meeting was worth billions, but to him it was simply another step on the path he had always followed: progress, power, profit. He had prepared for it as he prepared for everything, leaving nothing to chance, reviewing the contracts until each clause felt like a line carved into stone. He sat in a conference hall surrounded by aides and lawyers, his calm voice issuing final instructions while his mind ticked forward with the precision of a clock. Nothing about this day was meant to surprise him, because in Michael Carter's world, surprise was another word for weakness. Yet outside of the polished conference room, fate was quietly setting the stage for a moment that would unravel everything he thought he understood. Down one of the ornate corridors of the hotel, where the air was heavy with the scent of flowers and furniture gleamed with polish, a little girl sat waiting. She did not belong to this world of suits and pearls, of deals and power. She was 7 years old, with long blonde hair tied back clumsily, a white dress that had already begun to wrinkle from the day's wear, and a denim jacket that seemed too big for her narrow shoulders. Her shoes were scuffed, her hands small and restless as she clutched the handle of a worn backpack. Her name was Emily. Emily had grown used to blending into the background, unnoticed by the guests who swept past her with their luggage and demands. Her mother worked as a maid in the hotel, often for long hours, and Emily had no choice but to wait for her, sometimes reading, sometimes simply watching the endless tide of strangers. She had learned to make herself invisible, to listen more than she spoke, to take up as little space as possible. Yet her wide blue eyes missed very little, and in her silence she had absorbed the languages and tones of the people who surrounded her. She often pretended the lobby was a stage and she was the only one who knew she was watching a play. On that particular morning, as Michael Carter prepared to sign away millions in a room filled with polished wood and glass, Emily's small world shifted. She had wandered closer to the service entrances, the places where hotel staff moved with hurried footsteps and hushed voices, carrying linens and trays out of sight of the guests. It was there, standing by a doorway half hidden in shadow, that she heard words that did not belong in the walls of this glittering palace. Two men in uniform spoke quietly, but their voices carried to her, and though anyone else might have ignored them, Emily froze. They were speaking Italian, a language her grandmother had once taught her in afternoons filled with lullabies and whispered stories. The words were not meant for a child's ears, and yet they pierced through her with a clarity that made her breath catch. She did not understand every sentence, but she caught enough to know the meaning. Eliminate. Alone. Today. She pressed herself against the wall, her heart thundering in her chest, as the men laughed softly before walking past. The pieces clicked together in her mind with a terrifying speed. They were not talking about just anyone. They were talking about Michael Carter, the man she had seen in newspapers, the man who was even now in one of those gleaming conference rooms. These were not protectors. They were predators, dressed like security, waiting for the moment when he would be vulnerable. Emily's small hands trembled as she gripped the strap of her backpack. She could have run to her mother, she could have hidden and pretended she heard nothing, but something in her would not allow her to stay still. She remembered her grandmother's voice teaching her the language, telling her words had the power to save or destroy, and she knew she could not let silence destroy this man. Summoning a courage far beyond her years, she turned toward the hall that led to the conference rooms. Her feet pounded against the carpet, her breath coming in sharp bursts, as she pushed open the doors and stepped into a world that would never have noticed her otherwise. At that exact moment, Michael Carter lifted his eyes from the documents in front of him and saw her. A small, trembling figure in the doorway, so out of place it seemed for an instant that she had wandered in by mistake. But when her voice broke the polished silence of the room with the words, "They want to hurt you," his world tilted, and for the first time in years, the unshakable man known for his cold composure felt his blood run cold. The day that was meant to be another triumph had just turned into something he could not control, and he did not yet understand that this little girl would change his life forever. The room fell into stunned silence as the child's words echoed through the conference hall, their raw urgency cutting through the polished atmosphere like a crack in glass. Michael Carter, a man who prided himself on recognizing manipulation and filtering truth from lies within seconds, found himself unable to dismiss the trembling voice that had just shattered the rhythm of his carefully orchestrated meeting. His advisors looked confused, some frowning at the interruption, others already rising to escort the child out, but Michael lifted a hand sharply to stop them. His gaze fixed on her, the tiny figure standing in the doorway, her face pale, her blue eyes wide and wet with the kind of fear that could not be faked. She clutched the edge of her denim jacket as if it could shield her, and though she looked ready to bolt, she refused to move until he acknowledged her. He rose slowly from his chair, every movement deliberate, his instincts battling between skepticism and something deeper, something he hadn't felt in years, an almost primal recognition of danger. He walked toward her, ignoring the nervous protests of his colleagues, and when he crouched slightly to meet her at eye level, he saw the way her small hands trembled against her sides. "What did you say?" His voice, normally so steady, carried a softer note he hardly recognized as his own. Emily swallowed, her lips pressing together before she whispered in broken phrases, her words spilling out in fragments of English mixed with the Italian she had overheard. She repeated the chilling fragments, "Eliminate, when he is alone, today." The air thickened. Michael felt the weight of those words sink into him, not as a paranoid suspicion but as truth. He had lived too long in a world where betrayal hid behind handshakes to ignore what he was seeing now. This was not the imagination of a child, not a prank or mistake. It was a warning. Before he could respond further, the conference door opened behind them, and one of the supposed security guards entered, his eyes flicking briefly toward the girl before settling on Michael with a look that was too sharp, too watchful. For the first time, Michael noticed the absence of the professional calm he expected in his guards. Instead, there was a tension, a readiness that chilled him. Michael reacted with a speed that shocked even himself. Without explanation, he reached for Emily's hand and pulled her gently but firmly toward him, turning her small body so she was shielded behind his own. His voice snapped like a command as he instructed his trusted aide to call in the head of real security and to clear the room immediately. The men around the table erupted in confusion, but Michael ignored them, his focus narrowed to the girl and the intruder who stood in the doorway. The imposter guard shifted slightly, and Michael's instincts screamed confirmation. This was not coincidence, and Emily's warning had just saved him from walking into whatever trap had been set. The next moments blurred. His genuine security team arrived, weapons drawn, their movements fast and precise, and the imposter was subdued, his disguise stripped away as the truth came spilling out. It was not just one man but part of a larger plan, an assassination attempt orchestrated with meticulous care. Later, Michael would learn that the infiltration had been weeks in the making, that the attackers had planned to strike during a carefully chosen window when he would be left briefly unguarded. But in that pivotal instant, all that mattered was the trembling girl whose sharp ears and instinctive courage had shifted the balance between life and death. When the immediate danger passed and the room settled into a chaotic mess of shouting, phone calls, and panicked guests being ushered to safety, Michael found himself standing apart from it all, still holding Emily's hand. She looked exhausted, her cheeks flushed, her eyes too big for her small face, but she did not let go of him. He studied her silently, wondering how fate had placed her in his path, and for the first time in his life, the man who thought he had control over every variable realized just how fragile that control was. He knelt again, softer this time, and asked her how she had known. Her voice wavered as she explained that she had overheard them speaking in Italian, and that her grandmother had once taught her enough to understand. Her explanation was simple, childlike in its honesty, but to Michael it carried a weight he could not ignore. He was a man who had survived boardroom betrayals and corporate warfare, who had outmaneuvered men twice as ruthless as himself, yet none of them had ever truly touched him the way this child had in a matter of minutes. She had saved him, not with power or money, but with courage and instinct. He realized, as he looked at her, that everything about his morning had been rewritten. The deal waiting on the table no longer mattered. The investors pacing nervously in the hall no longer mattered. The only thing that mattered was the girl who had just shifted the course of his life, and the gnawing question of why a child like her was here in the first place, unnoticed and unprotected in a world where danger lurked behind uniforms and polished smiles. As the hotel's chaos began to settle and the danger was officially declared neutralized, Michael made a decision that surprised even himself. He would not let her slip back into invisibility, not after this. He would know her name, he would know her story, and he would know why fate had chosen her as the one to break through the fortress of his carefully constructed world. And as he walked her out of the conference room, his hand still enveloping her tiny one, he sensed that his life, once defined by profit margins and power plays, was about to change in ways he could never have predicted. Michael had always believed that fear was something he had outgrown, a weakness left behind in his youth, replaced by the discipline and calculation that had carried him to the top. But in the hours after the incident in the hotel conference hall, as the imposters were dragged away and his security team scrambled to assess the breach, he realized that true fear came not from threats against himself but from what could have happened if he had ignored the voice of the small girl who now sat quietly in his private suite. She looked impossibly small in the oversized armchair, her legs tucked beneath her, her denim jacket wrapped tightly around her as if she were trying to disappear into it. She did not cry, though her eyes were still swollen from earlier tears, and she did not fidget or speak. Instead, she sat still, watching the room with the same alertness that had saved him only hours ago, as though she had already learned that silence often meant survival. Michael dismissed the last of his advisors and closed the door, leaving only himself and Emily in the suite. For the first time since he had met her, there was no chaos, no shouting, no urgency. Just the quiet hum of the city far below and the stillness of the girl who had shifted the course of his day. He poured himself a glass of water, though his hands lingered at the rim of the glass longer than usual, betraying the unease he refused to show. Finally, he turned to her and asked the most basic of questions, "What is your name?" She lifted her chin slightly, her voice soft but steady when she replied, "Emily." He repeated the name under his breath, tasting it, grounding it in his memory. For a man who dealt with countless names every day, executives, investors, rivals, this one felt different, as though it carried a weight beyond its simplicity. He began asking her questions carefully, not wanting to frighten her further, and little by little her story emerged. Her mother worked at the hotel, cleaning rooms and working double shifts to cover bills, leaving Emily often to wait in lobbies or wander the halls. Her father was gone, a name she did not mention, a shadow that needed no explanation. Emily spoke haltingly, her small hands twisting in her lap, but every word she offered drew Michael deeper into a world he had never allowed himself to consider. A child who lived in the margins of wealth, surrounded by grandeur she did not belong to, surviving quietly while the powerful moved around her, oblivious to her existence. He listened longer than he intended, his heart tightening as she explained how she had recognized the words in Italian, how her grandmother had once lived with them and had taught her enough of the language for lullabies and stories, never imagining it would one day save a man's life. For the first time in years, Michael found himself at a loss for words. He had faced boardrooms where silence meant defeat, where every pause was filled with strategy, but now the silence felt necessary, a space to let her know he was not going to dismiss her or hurry her along. He studied her as she lowered her gaze again, and what struck him most was not just her courage but the exhaustion etched into her small frame, the kind of weariness that should not belong to a child. He wondered how many times she had waited alone in those grand halls, ignored by men like him who never thought to look past their own reflections in the glass. When the head of security entered to update him on the captured men, Michael waved him silent and gestured toward the girl. He demanded to know how they had missed such an infiltration, how it was possible that a child had noticed what trained professionals had not. The man stammered through explanations, offering reassurances that they were tightening protocols, but Michael dismissed him with a look so cold it silenced any further defense. When the door closed again, Michael's gaze returned to Emily, and he realized that the question pressing hardest against his mind was not how his enemies had reached him, but how fate had placed this girl in his path. The evening stretched on, and eventually he ordered dinner for them both. When the plates arrived, Emily hesitated at first, her small hands hovering over the food as though unsure whether she was allowed to take it. Michael gently nudged the plate closer, watching her finally give in to hunger. She ate slowly, carefully, as though rationing each bite, and the sight made something inside him ache in a way he had not expected. For a man who had lived surrounded by excess, who thought nothing of leaving meals unfinished at restaurants where the bill rivaled a worker's monthly pay, the quiet discipline in her eating was a revelation. Later, when the city outside the windows turned to night, Emily began to doze in the chair, her body finally succumbing to exhaustion. Michael found himself watching her longer than he should have, the rise and fall of her small shoulders, the way her hair fell across her cheek, the faint traces of fear that had not yet left her face. He realized that her presence had unsettled him in ways no rival could. He had been reminded of a truth he had long ignored, that his empire, his wealth, his carefully calculated life could crumble in an instant, and that salvation could come from the most unexpected places. As he stood by the window, looking out at the glittering skyline that had always symbolized his achievements, Michael Carter admitted something to himself that he had never dared before. He owed his life not to the empire he had built, not to the fortune he commanded, but to a 7-year-old girl who should have been invisible to his world. And in that admission, he felt something shift, as though the foundation of his life had been altered forever. The following morning, Michael awoke in his penthouse with the unsettling feeling that his world had tilted permanently. The skyline outside his glass walls shimmered in the early light, the towers he had built standing like monuments to his discipline, yet for the first time they seemed hollow, stripped of their former significance. He had survived an assassination attempt, his enemies had been captured, his empire had not collapsed, and by all accounts, he should have been returning to business as usual. But nothing about him felt usual anymore. His thoughts were not on contracts or profits but on the image of a little girl curled up in an armchair, her small body too weary for her age, her blue eyes carrying more courage than most men he had ever met. At the office, his board of directors awaited him with a mixture of concern and impatience. They expected him to address the breach in security, to reassure investors, and to strategize how best to control the inevitable media frenzy. Instead, Michael opened the meeting with a question that left them all momentarily silent. Had any of them noticed the child in the hotel lobby, the girl who had been waiting while her mother worked, the girl who had risked herself to warn him? The executives shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances, because none of them had. To them, children in hotel corridors were as invisible as the staff who cleaned their rooms. Michael's voice grew colder as he pointed out the irony, that a 7-year-old had seen what trained professionals had missed, that the empire he had built on precision and control had been saved not by money or power but by someone the world overlooked without thought. As his words cut through the room, several directors attempted to steer the discussion back to business, but Michael silenced them with a glare. For the first time, they realized he was not interested in their strategies or their reassurances. His focus had shifted, and it was not a temporary distraction. He demanded accountability from his security team, firing 2 senior staff on the spot when they failed to answer basic questions about how imposters had been able to infiltrate so easily. But more than that, he demanded to know how it was possible that a child had been left unprotected in the middle of a place they controlled. No one had answers. They stammered, tried to deflect, but Michael's fury was sharp and relentless. He had always been ruthless in business, but this was different. This was personal. When the meeting ended, Michael did not linger to review contracts or entertain nervous calls from investors. Instead, he ordered his driver to take him to the part of the city he had only ever passed by without noticing. It was there, in a crumbling apartment block with peeling paint and narrow, dimly lit hallways, that Emily and her mother lived. The contrast was jarring. Only hours earlier he had been seated at a marble conference table worth more than an entire year's rent for families in this building. Now, as he climbed the creaking stairs and knocked gently on the door, he felt the weight of that disparity press heavily against him. Margaret Hayes opened the door, her frame thin and fragile, her face pale with exhaustion. She looked startled to see him, and for a moment she seemed ready to apologize, as if she had somehow wronged him by existing in a world so far removed from his. But before she could speak, Emily appeared from behind her, her small hand clutching the fabric of her mother's sleeve. Michael felt a strange tightening in his chest when he saw her again, as though the fear of the day before had not fully left him until he confirmed with his own eyes that she was safe. Inside, the apartment was clean but sparse, every surface revealing the weight of years lived in survival mode. A small table covered with papers and unpaid bills sat by the window, and in the corner a thin mattress served as Emily's bed. Margaret tried to explain, her voice halting, that she had been doing her best, that she never meant for her daughter to be in danger, that Emily was not supposed to overhear anything. Michael listened silently, his expression unreadable, but inside his anger was not at her but at himself, at the world he had built his fortune in, a world where a woman like Margaret was left with no options but to work herself to exhaustion while her child lingered in hotel lobbies unnoticed. Emily stayed close to her mother at first, her blue eyes cautious, watching him carefully as though still unsure whether to trust him. But when he crouched down again, leveling himself so his gaze met hers, and thanked her quietly for saving his life, she blinked in surprise. It was not the grand, commanding tone of a billionaire speaking to someone beneath him. It was simply a man speaking with sincerity, acknowledging a debt that could never be repaid. She nodded slightly, and though she said nothing, her small shoulders eased, as if the acknowledgement alone had lifted a weight. When he left that evening, Michael carried with him an unease that no amount of power could soothe. He returned to his penthouse and stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the glittering skyline that had always been a source of pride. But all he could see in the reflection was the shadow of a little girl who had risked herself to warn him and the fragile world she returned to each night. For the first time, he understood that his empire was not as invulnerable as he believed, and that his greatest challenge was not in conquering markets but in deciding what kind of man he was going to be in the wake of a child's bravery. That night, long after the city had gone quiet, Michael Carter lay awake in his bed and made a decision that startled even him. He would not let this girl slip back into invisibility. Her life had intersected with his, and whether he was ready or not, he knew he would never be the same. The days after his visit to Margaret and Emily's apartment refused to leave Michael's mind, no matter how many hours he buried himself in contracts, negotiations, or the endless stream of reports that demanded his attention. His empire was a machine that never stopped, yet for the first time in his career he found himself stepping away from it, canceling meetings, arriving late to board sessions, and leaving early with the kind of excuses that would have once been unthinkable for him. His colleagues and investors whispered, some concerned, others suspicious, but Michael barely noticed. He was no longer looking at spreadsheets and stock prices with the same cold detachment. Instead, he saw the stack of unpaid bills on Margaret's table, the mattress in the corner of their apartment that passed for a child's bed, and the eyes of a little girl who ate cautiously as though food might disappear at any moment. He began returning to see them, sometimes under the pretense of checking on Margaret's health, other times without explanation at all. Margaret grew weaker with each visit, her cough worsening, her frame shrinking under the weight of illness and exhaustion. She always tried to meet him with politeness, her thin smile masking the depth of her suffering, but Michael saw through it easily. He had dealt with too many liars in his life to be fooled by the kind of honesty that came only from desperation. Margaret did not ask for help outright, but her silence carried the weight of every unspoken plea. And Emily, who hovered constantly near her mother, revealed more of herself each time. At first she barely spoke, her words short and guarded, but slowly she began to let down her guard, bringing him her drawings, telling him shy details about school, and even laughing occasionally, though each laugh seemed like a small rebellion against the sadness that lived in their home. One evening, Michael sat with Emily at the table while Margaret slept in the other room. Emily was coloring on a scrap of paper, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration, and when he asked what she was drawing, she held it up proudly. It was a house with 3 figures standing in front of it, a tall man, a woman with long hair, and a small girl holding both their hands. She said softly that it was the family she wanted, and the innocence of her words struck him like a blow. For years he had defined himself through towers of steel and glass, through balance sheets and headlines, and yet here was a child reminding him that none of it mattered compared to the simplicity of belonging. He found himself unable to speak, and instead he reached out and smoothed the paper gently, as though it were something fragile he could not afford to damage. The press soon caught wind of his repeated visits to a rundown neighborhood, and speculation spread like wildfire. Some accused him of hiding a scandal, others insisted it was a public relations stunt, an attempt to soften the image of a ruthless millionaire. Michael ignored every rumor. He had spent his life controlling narratives, bending the media to his will, but this was one battle he refused to waste energy on. He did not care what they thought, because the truth was something they could never understand. For him, it was not about image. It was about the quiet sound of Emily's voice when she asked him questions about the world, the trust in her eyes when she began to believe he would not disappear, the faint smile on Margaret's face when she realized her daughter was laughing again. In his penthouse, he felt the contrast more starkly than ever. The silence of his vast rooms had once been a comfort, a fortress where he could retreat from the demands of the world. Now it felt empty, almost suffocating, because it lacked the presence of that fragile life that had somehow become intertwined with his own. He found himself standing by the window at night, staring out at the glittering skyline that represented his triumph, and wondering if all of it was worth anything if he failed to protect one small child who had already done more for him than he could ever repay. Eventually, Michael made a decision that surprised even himself. He called his lawyers and instructed them to begin preparing documents that would allow him to assume guardianship of Emily should anything happen to Margaret. His lawyers were stunned, questioning whether he understood the complications, the public scrutiny, the endless legal obstacles. Michael silenced them with a single look. He was not asking for their opinion. He was giving them an order. He had spent his entire life building walls around himself, ensuring that no one could get close enough to hurt him, but those walls had crumbled the moment Emily burst into his life with words that had saved him. There was no going back. That night, he drove back to Margaret's apartment without telling anyone. When he knocked softly on the door, Emily opened it, her blue eyes lighting up with something he had not expected to see, relief. She let him in without hesitation, and as he sat in their small kitchen, Margaret appeared, her body frail but her eyes sharp with both gratitude and fear. She tried to thank him for everything he had done already, for the medical care, the rent, the food, but he stopped her gently. He told her that what he had done was nothing compared to what she and her daughter had given him. He promised her, with a quiet conviction that surprised even him, that Emily would never be left alone, not while he lived. Margaret's lips trembled, her eyes filling with tears, and for a long moment none of them spoke. As he left that evening, Michael understood the truth more clearly than ever before. The man who had once defined himself by skyscrapers and profit margins was gone, replaced by someone he barely recognized but finally respected. He was not just Michael Carter, the untouchable CEO, the ruthless millionaire. He was a man who had been saved by a child, and who now carried the responsibility of saving her in return. And for the first time in decades, he felt that this was the only battle that truly mattered. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Michael had ever experienced, and though the world around him kept moving with the same relentless speed, his life had shifted onto an entirely different axis. He continued to oversee his empire, signing contracts, attending meetings, and making decisions worth millions, but his mind was never fully in the room. More often than not, while an executive droned on about projections, Michael would find himself thinking of Emily, of the way she hesitated before laughing as if joy was something she had to ask permission for, or the way Margaret's cough lingered in the silence of their small apartment long after her polite smiles faded. For the first time in his life, he felt the crushing weight of helplessness, because money, his usual weapon and shield, could not reverse time or heal everything. It could provide the best doctors, the best medicine, the most comfortable bed, but it could not restore the strength Margaret was losing day by day. Michael visited them as often as his schedule allowed, and soon enough, he realized that his presence was no longer just an intrusion but an expectation. Emily began to wait for him, her small face lighting up when she heard his knock at the door, her cautious smile blooming into something freer when she realized he had returned yet again. She would pull him into her world, showing him her drawings, her worn books, even small treasures like buttons or stones she had collected, and he listened with an attentiveness that surprised even him. In those moments he was not the CEO of a vast corporation but simply a man learning how to be present, how to see the world through the eyes of a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly. Margaret, on the other hand, seemed to be retreating from that world more each day. She tried to hide it, summoning the strength to prepare small meals or fold laundry, but Michael could see how her hands trembled, how her breathing grew shallow after the smallest task. He often insisted she rest, taking over simple chores himself while Emily giggled at the sight of a man in an expensive suit struggling to cook pasta or fold blankets unevenly. Margaret would watch them with a soft expression, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and sadness, as though she knew she was watching a life she would soon have to leave behind. At his office, whispers spread quickly. Employees noticed the changes in him, the way he left earlier than usual, the way he canceled late-night meetings, the way his cold efficiency seemed softened at the edges. Some speculated he was distracted by a scandal, others thought he had found a woman who occupied his time, but no one could guess the truth. Michael ignored their gossip. For the first time in his career, he did not care how he was perceived, because he knew the choices he was making mattered in a way they never had before. He had built towers that pierced the skyline, but none of them compared to the fragile bond forming with the little girl who had once saved his life. One night, after a long day of balancing business with his visits to the apartment, Michael arrived to find Emily sitting on the floor beside her mother's bed. She was reading softly from a children's book, her voice uneven but determined, and Margaret lay listening, her eyes half closed, a faint smile on her lips. When Emily noticed him, she closed the book and climbed quickly into his lap as though she had been waiting for him to arrive, and Michael felt her small body relax against him. Margaret's eyes met his, and in that gaze he saw both gratitude and resignation. Later, when Emily had fallen asleep curled up on the bed, Margaret whispered to him that she was not afraid for herself but terrified for her daughter, terrified of what would happen when she was gone. Her voice cracked when she admitted she had nothing to leave Emily but love, and that love would not be enough to keep her safe. Michael listened in silence, his throat tight, and then told her with a conviction that startled even him that Emily would never be alone, not while he was alive. He promised her that he would take care of her daughter, not as charity, not as an obligation, but as something far deeper. Margaret's lips trembled, and though she tried to reply, she only nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. In that moment Michael realized that promises were no longer words to him, not when a dying woman was holding him to them with every last ounce of her strength. As the days continued, he began to make concrete moves. He contacted his lawyers to accelerate the guardianship process, instructing them to prepare for every obstacle, every legal complication, and every public battle that might arise. He did not care how messy it became. He would fight until it was settled, because the thought of Emily being taken by the state, shuffled into a system that saw children as numbers, was unbearable. He had faced ruthless competitors and hostile markets, but this fight felt more personal than any of them, and he knew he would not lose. That night, as he returned to his penthouse and stood once again before the massive windows that looked out over the city, Michael no longer saw his empire reflected in the glittering skyline. What he saw instead was a fragile but undeniable truth, that his life was no longer his own. It belonged now to the little girl who trusted him and to the promise he had made to her mother. For a man who had once built his world on control and ambition, it was a revelation that terrified and liberated him all at once. And though he did not know what the future would bring, he knew he would face it differently than he ever had before, because for the first time, he had something worth more than all the towers of glass and steel combined. The day Margaret slipped away was one that Michael would never forget, etched into his memory with a clarity so sharp it cut each time he recalled it. The doctors had warned him that her body was failing, that despite the treatments and the medications and every attempt to buy her more time, her strength had been worn down too far. But hearing the words and living through them were two different things. That morning the air in the small apartment felt heavy, as though the walls themselves knew what was coming. Margaret lay in her bed, her breathing shallow, her face pale but peaceful, and Emily sat beside her, clutching her mother's hand with a determination no child should ever have to summon. Michael had been there since dawn, sitting silently in a chair that felt too small for the enormity of the moment, watching as Emily read softly from one of her books. Her voice trembled, breaking on the words, but she pressed on, because she knew her mother wanted to hear her. When her eyes filled with tears and she couldn't continue, Michael gently took the book from her and read aloud, his deep voice carrying the story forward while Margaret's faint smile lingered. For a man who had spoken in boardrooms to thousands, his voice had never felt so fragile as it did reading those simple lines, knowing they might be the last words Margaret heard. As the hours stretched, Margaret summoned what strength she had left to turn her gaze toward him. Her eyes, though dimmed by exhaustion, still carried an intensity that cut through him. In a voice barely more than a whisper, she asked him to promise that Emily would never be abandoned, that she would never be left to the world's indifference. She told him that Emily was strong but still only a child, that she needed someone to see her, to protect her, to guide her through the years Margaret would not be there to witness. Michael, his throat tightening, took her frail hand in both of his and swore to her that Emily would be his responsibility, that he would not just provide for her but love her in the way a parent should. He promised that her daughter would never know the fear of being alone again. Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile, her eyes softening as though she could finally set down the burden she had carried alone for too long. Hours later, as the sunlight faded into evening, she exhaled one last breath and was gone. The apartment became unbearably quiet. Emily let out a broken cry and buried her face against her mother's still body, her small shoulders shaking with grief. Michael moved to her side, pulling her gently into his arms, and though she resisted at first, clinging to her mother as if she could will her back to life, eventually she collapsed against him, sobbing into his chest. He held her tightly, one hand stroking her hair, his own eyes burning with tears he did not try to stop. He had faced the collapse of deals worth billions, betrayals by men he had once trusted, even threats to his life, but none of those battles compared to the devastation of holding a child who had just lost the only person she thought would never leave her. The days that followed were a blur of arrangements and decisions. Michael handled the funeral himself, ensuring that Margaret was buried with dignity, sparing Emily from the harsh logistics that no child should endure. The ceremony was small and quiet, attended by only a handful of acquaintances and colleagues from the hotel. Emily clung to his hand throughout, her eyes red and swollen, her face pale with grief, and he stayed at her side without wavering. To outsiders it may have looked strange to see a powerful CEO kneeling beside a little girl at a modest funeral, whispering comfort to her as though she were his own, but Michael cared nothing for appearances. In that moment, Emily was all that mattered. Not long after, social services reached out, their tone clinical and detached as they spoke of procedures, foster systems, and temporary placements. They explained that decisions would have to be made, that guardianship was complicated, that even with his resources the law would take time. Michael listened in silence until they suggested that perhaps Emily would be better off with a family already approved by the state. At that, his voice cut through the room with an authority that silenced them. He told them flatly that Emily was already with her family, that she was under his protection, and that no system or court would remove her from his side. The officials tried to protest, reminding him of the scrutiny such an arrangement would bring, but Michael's expression turned to ice. He had won wars in boardrooms against men twice as ruthless, and he was prepared to fight harder for this child than he had ever fought for profit. The legal battle began almost immediately, and the media latched onto the story with a frenzy. Headlines speculated endlessly: was this a publicity stunt, an attempt at image rehabilitation, or perhaps some hidden scandal? Reporters camped outside his offices and penthouse, demanding answers, but Michael ignored them all. He refused to issue statements, refused interviews, refused to give the world anything more than his presence at every hearing. What mattered was not what the world thought, but what Emily needed, and she needed to see him there, unwavering, steady, a figure who would not disappear no matter how loud the storm grew. At night, Emily often woke from nightmares, calling for her mother in a broken voice. Each time Michael was there, sitting by her bed, taking her hand until her breathing steadied and she drifted back into uneasy sleep. She began to realize that he meant what he said, that he was not another adult who would vanish when things grew difficult. She still cried often, but she no longer cried alone. Slowly, cautiously, she began to lean on him, testing his promises, and each time he proved himself, her trust deepened. When the court granted him temporary custody, the headlines exploded, but Michael hardly noticed. What mattered to him was that Emily now lived under his roof, surrounded not by loneliness and fear but by a home where she was seen and cared for. She was still fragile, her grief raw and heavy, but there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when she smiled or laughed, and in those moments Michael felt something stir inside him that he had thought long dead. He had made countless promises in his life, but this was the only one that mattered, and he knew with absolute certainty that he would keep it. A year passed, and though grief still lingered like a shadow, the outlines of a new life began to take shape. Michael found himself settling into a rhythm that was unlike anything he had ever known, a rhythm dictated not by meetings or contracts but by the needs of a child who had slowly become the center of his existence. His penthouse, once cold and echoing with silence, now carried the soft chaos of toys left on the floor, drawings taped to the refrigerator, and the sound of footsteps that belonged not to staff but to Emily herself as she moved freely through the rooms she now called her home. Where once there had been only marble and glass, now there were traces of life and warmth, the kind of ordinary messiness that no fortune could ever purchase but which Michael discovered was far more valuable than all the symbols of success he had surrounded himself with. Emily grew stronger in that year, her laughter returning in bursts at first, tentative and uncertain, and then gradually blossoming into something free and unrestrained. She began to chatter about her school days at dinner, telling him stories about classmates and teachers with the animated gestures of a child who no longer feared being silenced. She filled sketchbooks with her drawings, many of which included him, always beside her, sometimes holding her hand, sometimes simply standing nearby like a protector in her world of imagination. For Michael, each drawing felt like proof that he had kept his promise, that she now saw him as something permanent, not another adult destined to vanish from her life. The first time she called him Dad, it was casual, spoken without hesitation as she asked him to help with a school project, and the word struck him with a force greater than any accolade he had ever received. He answered her without pause, but later that night he stood by her doorway watching her sleep, replaying the sound of that single word until he felt something inside him settle into place, as though a part of him he had never known was missing had finally been restored. Michael's colleagues noticed the change in him, though few dared to speak of it. He no longer lingered in the office late into the night, no longer treated every negotiation as though it were life or death. His decisions remained sharp, his instincts as ruthless as ever in business, but his priorities had shifted. He began declining events, cutting short trips, and insisting on being home for dinners and school recitals. Some whispered that he was softening, that his edge was dulling, but Michael knew the truth. He was not weaker. He was stronger, anchored now by something far more enduring than profit margins. For the first time, he did not measure success by numbers but by the smile of a little girl who waited for him at the end of each day. The legal battles eventually ended in his favor, and Emily was officially his daughter in the eyes of the law. The papers were signed in a quiet courtroom, but for Michael the ceremony was unnecessary. The bond had already been sealed in countless unspoken moments, the nights he stayed awake comforting her after nightmares, the mornings he packed her school lunches with clumsy hands, the afternoons he listened to her chatter about things he barely understood but pretended to follow just to see her excitement. Still, when the judge pronounced the adoption final, Michael felt an overwhelming sense of relief, not for himself but for Emily, who now had the certainty that no one could take her away again. She squeezed his hand in that courtroom, her eyes shining with tears, and whispered thank you, and though the words were small, he knew they carried the weight of everything she had endured and everything she now believed in. Their life together became a series of new traditions that seemed ordinary to outsiders but sacred to them. On Sundays they cooked breakfast together, often ending with flour on the counters and eggs spilled on the floor, and Michael laughed more in those mornings than he ever had in years of business victories. On evenings they read side by side, Emily curled against him with a book while he pretended to focus on his own papers but secretly found himself watching the way her lips moved as she read aloud. On the anniversary of the day she had saved his life in that hotel, they released a balloon into the sky with a note tied to it. Emily's note that year read, "We are a family now," and Michael stood beside her on the balcony watching it disappear into the clouds, his chest heavy with emotions he no longer tried to hide. The world outside still speculated, reporters occasionally tried to spin their story into a headline, but Michael no longer cared. He had spent his entire life chasing power and reputation, guarding himself against vulnerability, but now he understood that vulnerability was not weakness at all. It was the courage to love, the courage to protect, the courage to be seen not as an untouchable figure but as a man who could kneel beside a child and promise her she would never be alone again. Emily had given him that gift, and in return he had given her the one thing she needed most: stability, love, and a place to belong. One evening, as they sat together on the penthouse balcony, the city lights glittering beneath them, Emily leaned her head against his arm and whispered that she was happy. It was such a simple statement, spoken without flourish, but for Michael it was more powerful than any declaration he had ever heard in his life. He turned to look at her, her blonde hair catching the glow of the city, her blue eyes bright with trust, and he realized that his greatest achievement was not the empire he had built but the family he had found. The man who had once been defined by wealth and power was now something else entirely. He was a father, and in that role, he had discovered the only legacy that truly mattered.